Well, thank you, Chancellor Lane. I just want to make sure the mic is working in the back. I get a thumbs up. Good. Because we're also recording this for people who can't be here today. So we do want to get this out to as many people as possible. But I do thank those of you who took the time to come this morning. What I will start with saying is nothing I'm presenting here is new. Everything that I'm presenting, as Chancellor Lane mentioned, was probably in the Chronicle or inside higher ed in various different ways, or it's in our strategic plans, both at the system and at the university level. So there's nothing I'm talking about that isn't things we know, but I think we're at a point where we need a common understanding of kind of where we've been, where we're at, and where we're heading. And I'm not sure that always exists on any university campus. And it's particularly critical at this time that we do, because we need to understand that enrollment is critical to our future, absolutely critical to our future. We must grow enrollment, and it is more challenging than it's ever been before. So, all right. Help. I don't have my glasses on, so I can't see anything.
Sarah, yeah, no problem.
All right, it's not. There we go. All right, we can edit that out later. So what I'll talk about is kind of, again, a little bit with the past, but again, the challenges aren't going away. If you look at across the state of Illinois this year, public institutions about half up, half down. I think it was 5 up, 7 down, but it, the challenges with enrollment are not new. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the national data later. And I'm going to start with the history lesson because I'm a believer. I was raised by a social studies teacher who believed that you need to understand history because you need to understand how we got to where we are in order to make the proper assessments and the proper changes going forward, because a lot of times we kind of misinterpret that history. And when we look at higher education, we have to understand first that growing enrollments was the norm for most of higher education for a lot of our history. This was particularly true in the post-World War II period, where you see between the GI Bill, expanding opportunities for people of color, expanding opportunities for women. All of this led to a general increase in enrollment and often rather rapid increases in enrollment across all of higher education. And when I came into higher education in the mid-90s, that trend had continued. In fact, if you look from 98 to 2011, nationally enrollments went up 25%. So we were seeing general increases in enrollment on a regular basis. And so one of the stories I often tell is I was at the University of Louisville in the mid-90s, and I made some changes. I was the head of the sports management program. I made some changes to our undergraduate and graduate programs, and we doubled enrollment. We went from about, and I don't mean we went from 10 to 20 students. I wouldn't say that's a big thing. We went from a little less than 200 to well over 400 students. But here's the thing about that story. Not one person said thank you. Not one person said good job. And to be honest, I was not expecting anybody to do so because I was not trying to grow enrollment. I was trying to create the best program I could for our students, and I accidentally grew enrollment. Now, I can tell you today, if a program went from 200 students to 400 students, we would notice it. I'm not even sure anybody noticed that we went up at the time. We weren't really focused on enrollment growth because it was happening naturally. In fact, I will say at the University of Louisville at that time, we were much more focused on improving the quality of incoming students and actually growing the freshman class. So we were in a different place because we had good state support. Our tuition rates were going up on a regular basis. Money was coming in. Things were going fairly well. So no one was focused on enrollment growth as a big issue. And because of that, we kept kind of doing the same things we had always done. So when it came to staffing, I would say that was always the one out, one in model. If you lost somebody, you got them back. In fact, at the provost office, when I worked there, I was in charge of all of the faculty requests, and that's pretty much what we did. In fact, the only time we didn't do that was if you could cobble enough money together that we could add faculty as opposed to subtract. That was the norm. And that same thing was true with staff. Salary increases were pretty regularly 3% or so, nothing. Building maintenance was taken care of. We kind of kept doing what we'd always been doing because what we were doing, frankly, was working. Now, some changes started, depending on which state you're in, somewhere in the 2000 period. And what that changed was state appropriations started to decline. So if we look at Illinois specifically, we went down about 25% in state appropriations from 2002 to 2019. If you do a present value analysis, which is much more accurate, it's about 50%. So we lost about half of our state appropriation over that 17-year period. I will say that's not unusual. That happened in most states across the country. When it started, how much it went down, that varies some, but the fact that it went down was pretty much the norm. And that's focused just on appropriations. The other thing that changed was capital funding. I just recently was part of a groundbreaking at the Edwardsville campus for their new health sciences building. I've been a president now. This is my 9th year. That was my first groundbreaking for a university facility supported by a state. In fact, I don't remember ever going to another one as long as I was administrator at Kent State either. So again, groundbreakings have not been the norm because we haven't been funding new facilities either. This is a big change. When I was at the University of Louisville early on, we would get a new building every 2 years. We just had to decide which building we wanted. Boy, that was a fun place to be. And what that means is a couple of things. One is we're able to expand the footprint, or in some cases, take down old buildings and put up new ones. We also had money available for deferred maintenance, which is critical because one of the things I remember, I was at a presentation at Kent State by the architects, and they showed the campus kind of every decade. Kent State started about 1914. So, here's what it looks like in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Boom, everything explodes. The campus gets much, much larger. 70s, same thing. And I remember sitting there thinking, God, that's why we have so much deferred maintenance. All of our buildings at that point were about 50 years old. That's natural things. Roofs are going to fall apart, pipes are going to fall apart. All of those things are happening. The problem is that was not budgeted for at all. And that shouldn't be surprising. Because if you go back to those legislators that were supporting those buildings in the 60s and 70s, you may find this shocking, but it's not a real big political win to say, hey, let's put more money into it, put more taxpayer money into a deferred maintenance fund that will help the building out in 30 years. No one gets reelected on that type of thing. So they weren't doing it. Universities expected the state to continue to support facilities the way they always had. Why would they think it was going to change? So they didn't put money aside. By the time they realize they have a problem, the money is not there to put aside anymore. So we are all dealing with deferred maintenance across the country. In fact, I did an accreditation visit when I was at my previous institution, and it was an institution that was brand new. They only had 3 buildings on campus, all brand new. And I remember all of us walking around saying, God, no deferred maintenance. That was the thought of every single person as part of that accreditation. There's probably about a dozen of us from different public universities across the South. What this means is now tuition revenue becomes much more critical because of the state appropriations going down. And so what we start to see is tuition increases combined with enrollment growth. So institutions start to grow more. They also increase tuition more. In Illinois, in the 6 years before 2011, the average annual increase in tuition was 10% at state institutions. That's 10% every year for 6 years. That was the average. SIU is not any different than that average. We were not higher than that average. We were pretty much, I think, slightly below it, actually, but right about where it was. I remember one year when I was at the University of Louisville, we bragged because we were the only university in the state of Kentucky that did not increase tuition double digits. We did it 9.9%. And we literally bragged to everyone who would listen that we only went up 9.9%. We're being very frugal. That was the reality of that decade. That obviously has changed, and we'll get to it, but it makes sense. It's a basic economics thing. Demand is high. You can increase your prices, and you're not going to lose enrollment. So that's what institutions did because they didn't have the state appropriations. So they kind of had to do it in order to maintain what they had been doing in the past. Well, then we get to 2008, and the financial crisis hits, and now all of a sudden state appropriations get cut. Most places even more because there's, again, less money available at the state level. 2008, I became a dean at Kent State. That is the first conversation we ever had about growing enrollment. I had been working in higher education at that point for about 15 years. We had never had a conversation about the need to grow enrollment until 2008 because we said, hey, we're going to get cut by the state. We can't increase tuition by enough to make that up. So we're going to have to grow our enrollment. And guess what we did? My college went up 15%. The university went up 10%. At that point, it was still relatively easy to do if you made some very basic differences in what you were doing. And so we were able to do it. And so the university actually thrived. We were an RCM campus at the time. So each college, our reserves went up. We were actually in still pretty good shape. Now, changes really start in 2011 nationally. A few things start to happen. One is we see declines in state or in graduates from high school in large parts of the Northeast and the Midwest. So there's less students to recruit from. That not only affects them, but it means as people are starting to recruit more nationally, it affects everybody to some degree, but certainly affects schools in that region more. High school graduates, we're seeing increasingly aren't going to college at the same rate that they used to. So it declined, the number goes down, and we also see less people going to college. And the flagships continue to grow. Nationally, there's a good article in the Chronicle recently, you can look it up. Flagships go up a lot during this period of time from 2011 on. In fact, remember those buildings? They funded those buildings by growing their enrollment. So their whole strategy was based on this. I saw it very much in South Carolina. The University of South Carolina, Clemson dramatically changed what their goals were as far as enrollment in order to get the money to help support what they needed to do, including enhancing their facilities, which they were able to do while the rest of us couldn't, because we had generally less enrollment, so we still had a lot of the same facility issues. So the running joke starts to become after 2011, flat is the new up. If you get flat, that's actually a good thing for most institutions, but the reality is a lot of them either are flat or start to decline. Now, I will say there's a few exceptions you can find, because everybody will always give me, well, what about them? Well, they may be in Texas. That's a different environment, growing size of the state, so they're not affected as much. They're in an urban environment. I saw this with UNC Charlotte. So you see some that are able to go against that trend, but by and large, most were going through that trend. That being said, it was different in Illinois. When I was at Winthrop, I actually did an analysis of many states, and I picked Illinois. And Illinois, I said, was the canary in the coal mine, because everything that was going to happen every place else happened here first, and it happened here worse. So if you look at the period from 2010 to 2019, enrollment, just looking at the SIU schools at Edwardsville, went down 14%. 14%. Now, I will say, when I got here, everybody told me Edwardsville was killing it. I'm not sure 14% is killing it, but that is a reality that they dealt with. They were killing it in comparison to Carbondale, that went down 43%. Statewide, it was about 30%. So again, we were a little bit worse here, but this was a trend that was hitting everybody to different degrees. And we can talk about what may have been different here, but it was a common thing. What this means now is we have now structural deficits in most budgets at most regional universities, which we have to deal with. And we're not designed to cut budgets quickly. Just not the way we're set up. Most of our costs are in personnel. 0% salary increases become the norm. That was certainly true at Louisville in the years after I left. I think they had like 5 or 6 years of 0% salary increases. The one out, one in, that's gone. Most places, a lot of it's much more rigorous in determining what positions we fill. And that deferred maintenance just gets a whole lot worse. So all of those things happen in large part because of what was happening nationally. And again, it was a little worse here. So in general, we start to see increasing financial challenges, declining state appropriations, declining or flat enrollment. And on top of that, remember those tuition increases? We stopped doing that because now the supply demand thing is not in our favor. So during the 6 years starting in 2016 in Illinois, the average tuition increase was less than 2% a year. And that was when we had the budget impasse where we should have been increasing tuition to offset that, and we couldn't because the economics of it simply did not work. So we start to see a real difference there. And in fact, the College Board just came out with a report this week. And one of the things that they found was that if you look at tuition in 2023 dollars, it's actually gone down in the last decade. Now, that goes against the narrative that college is becoming more and more expensive. It actually has decreased. That's the sticker price. When you look at the net price, it's an even different story. And I'll talk about that in just a second. So one of the things that I did a couple of years ago, my daughter was a high school senior. So she became my secret shopper. I had her apply to 14 institutions across the country. Now, my wife always jokes that my daughter is just like me, and she is. I will say my wife doesn't always smile when she says that, but she is. She's very much like me. And one of the ways she's like me is academically, athletically, student activities. Our high school records look almost identical. So I can compare what she experienced versus what I experienced. And we applied to very similar schools. I applied for 5, she applied for 14. Part of the reason we could apply for 14 is most of those applications were free now, which they weren't back when I applied for 5. I applied for 5. I got a scholarship offer at 1. It was $1,000 a year, and it was still my most expensive school. She applied to 14. She got scholarships offers from 11. The only 3 she did not were, you may guess it, flagships that had more enrollment than they knew what to do with. So they had no need to give her any scholarship support. On top of that, I didn't respond to any of them until May 1st. See what happens if we don't respond, even though we knew where she was going back in January. 3 of them came back with bigger offers. One of them, $10,000 more a year. That is the competitive market that we live in. And I actually have told the story that what we pay for her tuition, now she goes to an in-state school back in South Carolina where we were before. I applied to Rutgers. I was from New Jersey, like Chancellor Lane. I applied to Rutgers. What we pay for her tuition is less than my parents would have paid for me at Rutgers in 1983. Now you say, lucky me. Not everybody has this. Actually, the College Board data would indicate that my daughter pays slightly more than the average for students at four-year public institutions for in-state students. So the average is actually less than I would have paid at Rutgers in 1983. So again, that whole notion of college costs going up so much. Now, what has gone up, and this is something I'm not saying that we don't have students with me, because we absolutely do. Housing and food have gone up dramatically, because guess what? Housing and food has gone up dramatically for everybody. That's not a college-related cost, because my daughter moved off campus and it's costing us more. So it's not necessarily what we're doing at the university. It's just the environment in which we live. On top of that, there's needs for phones, laptops. I always say I had a typewriter with the corrector type, and that was like the cutting edge technology at the time. That's not the case anymore. So the costs that they have are just, quite frankly, much, much greater. And so there still is lots of need. And so, I'll come back to that. But again, it's not the tuition cost that actually has gone down. Now, differences in Illinois again, always differences here. One, we had the budget impasse. I always say the best way to understand the budget impasse is to imagine if you were unemployed for a year and had no salary coming in. Even when you're employed again, there's an impact of not getting money for a period of time that stays with you for a long period of time. The other thing is the budget impasse caused a decrease in faith in institutions in Illinois, which hurt us on the enrollment side. So we got hit doubly. And I've actually done that analysis. In general, we were going down already across the state. We went down about 3% more per year for about a 2-year period than we were before that or after that. So that's another about, say 6% decrease in enrollment. And that's a lot of money and a lot of students. So again, that hurt us. The other thing is we have what's called truth in tuition. Now, this is nice for families. They know whatever they get charged their freshman year, it's not going to change. But that means every time we go up on that 2%, the impact is minimal because it only affects the freshman class. So as we're trying to make up money through enrollment, we have to understand we're not dealing with the same environment as everybody else does. So declining enrollments now are pretty much the norm. If we look since 2015, down about 12%, and that's projected to get worse. I will say, again, the College Board came out with some data this week just about the changes, or a couple of sources have come out with changes in enrollment. One of the things that they've found is that, well, here's the good news. Enrollment is up this year nationally. First time in several years, it's up 2.1%. That is the only good news. Once you dig into the numbers, it gets a lot worse. Community college enrollment actually led that for the most part. Community college enrollment went up a lot, and most of their increase was in dual enrollment, which is those who are in this world know that usually doesn't make any money. In fact, sometimes it loses you money. So it actually isn't a financial boon for even the community colleges. On top of that, when we look at incoming students, freshmen, that was down 3.6%. You look at traditional age freshmen, it was down 5.2%. If you look at public four-year institutions, it was down 6.9%. So the fact that we're up at Carbondale this year is going completely against the grain. It was funny when we put out the enrollment numbers, like everybody's going up. It's like, I don't know who this everybody is, but that is not what the data is telling us at all. So it actually is starting to go down. And this is before the enrollment cliff. We've all talked about the enrollment cliff for years now. 2025, we know because of the financial crisis, people had less kids. In fact, from about 2008 to 2019, they had about 6.6 million fewer kids than would have happened if we had stayed at the 2007 level. So that's going to lead to a decline in enrollment. One of the studies projected that would go down 10 to 20% starting in 2025 for institutions like ours. I will tell you, I've looked at that study's data over the last several years, and they are very optimistic. That is not, they have been way overestimating how well we're going to do. So it's likely going to be worse than that. So now that I've thoroughly depressed all of you, which is not my goal, and I will say, yeah, maybe a good idea. And I always point out, I'm a glass 3/4 full kind of guy. So I see options and possibilities, and that's really what I want to focus on. I want to get us to the place of being also optimistic and positive about the future. I will say I have a good friend, and she describes herself as a glasses empty, dirty, and cracked. If you're that type of person, then I'm not sure I can help too much, but I will do my best even in those cases. A few things about this. One is, before I even get started on some of these things on the slide, we're not stopping recruiting high school seniors. That has continues to be critically important. That will continue to be a huge focus of our efforts. We are going to need to be much more aggressive on that than we have, and we've already been doing that. We were just talking about Chancellor Lane's involvement in that, direct involvement. Chancellor Minor does the same thing. Yeah, I don't think I met my university president until I got to campus, and frankly, if I wasn't student government president, I would have never met him again the rest of the time I was there. We're in a whole different world. It's an all hands on deck when it comes to recruiting high school seniors. But the reality is, if that number is going down dramatically, to think that we will continue to increase, since 2019 in Carbondale, we've gone up about 56%. The idea that we can continue to do that year after year probably is not realistic. We're going to have to do other things too. And so all of these strategies I'm going to talk about involve change. And in a changing environment, it only makes sense that you're going to have to change your strategies. And so change becomes absolutely critical. I will say it is not something in higher education we do particularly well. A former president wrote a book recently. It was titled, "Whatever It Is, I'm Against It." We don't adapt to change quickly, but we're going to have to. It's absolutely critical for our future. Second, it cannot be accomplished by any one person or group, not myself, not Chancellor Lane, not Wendell Williams. None of us can do this alone. This really has to be a team effort, and everybody can play a part, whatever that part is. You go back to my U of L story. Now, I'm not sure I could double enrollment in any program today. That's much more challenging than it was in the 1990s. But those changes were changes I made as an assistant professor, and given my discipline, probably the most poorly paid assistant professor on the campus. I did things that increased enrollment. And frankly, I was the only one who could. My provost at the time, one was an English PhD and the next was a nursing PhD, brilliant people, but they didn't know what to do in a sports management program. I knew what to do in a sports management program. I knew what was going to be appealing to students. So a lot of us can make changes, and I'll talk about some of those in a bit. Third thing is, these are models from other institutions and other systems. Nothing I'm talking about is new. These are things other places have done and done effectively. So these are what I would call data-based changes. David Shirley, I see you back there. Database is a good thing. Using your data to make decisions that make sense is a really good thing. And again, we know based on what they've done, if we do some of these same things, it'll be effective. Now, I will say it was funny because we have a white paper that goes along with this, which we'll share as well. Someone asked me, is everybody else going to steal the playbook? I was like, it's not a new playbook. It's already there. I'm guessing we'll do better at that change thing than those other places will, because again, changes tends to be hard for us. Next, they're aligned with alumni and student success. Whenever we talk about changing thing in higher education, the first reaction is we're going to dumb it down. We're going to make it easy for students. We're going to be less rigorous. I worked with the provost once who said, we're really good at confusing rigidity with rigor. We do things in the name of rigor that are really just about being rigid. They're not making students any well prepared for life, for the workforce, but we do them because, well, we've always done it that way, and it seems rigorous because we're being inflexible, not because we're actually doing something to help students. Everything I'm talking about is actually about improving student success and making things better for students, not actually doing anything that would take away from their future success. Next, none of these strategies alone will work. So as I present 6 strategies, you can't say, well, I like number 1 and let's just do that one and forget the other 5. All of these are somewhat interconnected, and each of these really will help in some way. One of the ones I'll talk about right away is retention. Edwardsville is on this 283 campaign, which is the number of students they would have to retain in addition to what they normally do to get to a 90% retention rate. even if they had retained 283 students this year, they still would have been down on enrollment. So 283 would have been great, but it would not have been enough. So what are the strategies? First, improving retention. Right now, our retention rates across the system is roughly 70%. Even as recently as 2020, we were about 80% across the system. If you increase by 10% for each institution, you're talking about 150, 160 students. That's a massive change in both their lives as well as the financial position. I often use kind of a really rough, it's hard to say with enrollment, how much each student is worth from a net tuition standpoint, because every student is different and there's all kinds of factors on campus, off campus. But sometimes you use 10,000 as a rough number. So if you start to use 10,000, 150 students retained is about $1.5 million. So every one of these things can make a financial difference as well as a difference in their lives. Now, as we look at what we can do, we have already done some of those things. We're starting to do some more. Along with the chancellor and a number of people here, we actually went to Georgia State this year to talk with them. And a few things we've learned about what they did. They are pretty much a national leader in using data to improve retention, improve graduation rates. They've done a wonderful job with a student population that's frankly not vastly different than ours. And one of the few things that they said was, one, they've been doing this for over a decade, and they kept adding things as they went along. And so they've constantly been changing and evolving. But part of the reason they're interesting is because they added it over time, you can actually see the impact of each one of those things, because they didn't do them all at once. So you can see it wasn't, exactly what changed their retention. The other thing they said is, hey, when you're trying to increase retention, you will always get this response. Well, nothing's going to work until we do X. They said, do something, do the thing that you can do most quickly, have success with that, and then build to the next one. So the fact that we can't maybe do every single thing that they talked about as effectively as they do in the first year doesn't mean we don't need to start working on it. And again, we've done some of these things. We have done summer success programs. Usually take students who were not predicted to be successful and put them on the pathway to success. And those have been very effective. We have provided more support for some students who needed it at different times. One of the things that Georgia State does very effectively is retention grants for students, who allows them to keep moving along where they might have dropped out. And we've been trying to do some of those types of things. So there's a number of things we can do and have been doing. Edwardsville did a Black Scholar experience this year, which was expanding a smaller program they had to all of their African-American freshmen. They went up 10% on retention for that particular demographic group. No reason why we can't expand that type of program to other places and to other groups as well. We also have, through the system, applied for a grant from the Lumina Foundation to create an opportunity to work with faculty and support faculty in doing some things that they may be able to do in the classroom. Some of it is not even necessarily changing any requirements in the class, although that's sometimes possible. But some of it is, how do you create this sense of belonging, the sense that we believe in students, providing the support that they may need. It's interesting, the research actually says that while a student's growth mindset is important, in other words, their belief in themselves that they can improve their performance is important, the faculty's growth mindset is more important. So statistically, the faculty believing the students can be successful. I actually come from one of those institutions, and they're a good example. A few years ago, the Education Trust put out a report on Black student success. Number one was Georgia State. Number two was Winthrop. We had horrible data. We had no money, but we had a group of faculty who believed every student could be successful. And I will say our student demographics were coming from the poorest schools in South Carolina, which is ranked near the bottom in high school performance. So wasn't getting outstanding students, wasn't any of those things, but the faculty willing to support and helping makes a difference. And so there's some things all of us can do, even in little ways, that make a difference. Improving transition to college is important as well. From community colleges and other institutions is important. The Chronicle recently had an article and actually cited another Illinois institution, not us, about how hard it is to transition from community colleges or other colleges into universities, and how rigid we are, not rigorous, rigid we are with what we count and don't count towards a student's degree. There's a lot of things we can do. There's a lot of ways we can make that more obvious and seamless. Arizona State has done a wonderful job with this, and their enrollment has gone up enormously. And this is part of their model, was actually just making it easier for students to see, if I took X here, then you can come here. I will say, I recognize we've done some of that. The Saluki Step Ahead is an outstanding example of making it very easy for students to see how they can transition and come to a university, but we can expand some of the ways we do course articulation and other things, again, to make that even easier. But that, if you keep in mind that when we look at our incoming students, new students, it was about 1,600 were freshmen this year, about 1,100 or so were transfer students. This is almost as big of a marketplace for us as freshmen are. So this becomes important. The more we can do this, the better. A better use of financial aid dollars. In a highly competitive environment, doing things the way we always have done them is probably going to be not so successful. And there's multiple groups. There's the group that with high need. And we have done a good job on the high need students in a number of different ways. As I said, what we're seeing, of course, we have MAP funding from the state, which is one of the most generous need-based programs I've seen. We also sometimes add in aim high. The Saluki commitment we've just announced, we're now up above $100,000 in family income. You can come tuition free. So we have done a lot of those things. That doesn't mean there's still not need. Again, housing, food, other expenses related to education that these students may need support on, and frankly, don't have anywhere else to get it. So we need to think about how do we use our financial aid dollars to meet them. There's also competition for the students who are at the higher income levels or middle income levels who don't qualify for that need base. I talked about my daughter's financial support. You're not gonna be shocked. I don't get any need-based aid. I make enough money. That's not what we're getting. It's all in merit-based aid. And the competition for that has become much greater. So one of the things we need to be able to do is use the dollars we have much more effectively. So we're not gonna be able to dramatically increase that, although I see Matt Kupek here. We'll try to keep increasing it. And we have increased it from the foundation, added another $1 million or so this year in scholarship support. That will help. But we also need to use those dollars as effectively as possible to meet the needs and attract the student body that we want to attract. And back to the Georgia State example, using it to retain and using it sometimes on transfer students, which traditionally don't get any scholarship offers. We use them all for freshmen. So again, we need to use our dollars, frankly, more effectively. Recognizing the changing demographics in recruitment. We already know that for the students under 18, they are no longer majority white. And we're already starting to see this in the students that we're bringing into universities. In fact, this year, white freshmen was down 9.4%. Remember, I said earlier, 3.6% decline in freshmen, 9.4% decline in white freshmen. So that's going down faster. Overall, for white enrollment was down about 1%. In contrast, Black, Latinx, Asian enrollment was all up, somewhere between 2 and 4%. So we're seeing, again, some demographic changes are already hitting. We expect that continue to happen. We also have to understand that the decision by the Supreme Court that affects the most elite institutions mean they're going to struggle probably to hit their diversity goals, which means we'll probably see even more diversity in institutions like ours going forward. So that means, and then there's also the international student population, which I don't want to ignore, which is a big one for us. Kind of went away a little bit, but it's coming back again now. So we're starting to see that number grow again. But the thing is, when we're recruiting a different group of students, whether it's international students, where we're using recruiters and agreements with institutions, other places, or we're recruiting diverse students domestically, different strategies are needed. We've already done some things with Spanish ads for SIU Carbondale. Having Spanish-speaking admissions counselors can help a lot. The Latinx population is the fastest growing one and projected to be going forward. So we need to think about that. But we also have to do things to create a sense of belonging once they're here. Talked about the Black Scholar experience that Edwardsville is doing that. Again, we can expand to other groups and across the system more. And really, this means all of our activities related to anti-racism, diversity, equity, inclusion aren't just the right thing to do, they're the smart thing to do. They're going to be necessities going forward as we see that changing demographics in our student body. So again, it's nice when right and smart are the same. We should note too, we have an advantage in Illinois. The rest of the country has become very anti-diversity. We have seen this in legislation consistently. We're not in one of those places. So we are an appealing place for most students of color, more so than we're seeing again across the rest of the country. I used the example the other day. One of my previous institutions, Kent State, no longer has a vice president for diversity, equity, inclusion. It's for people, belonging, and culture. people as opposed to I don't know what. And I can pretty much guarantee that belonging is not really creating a sense of more belonging by changing that title the way that they did. And again, that's no criticism of the people there. They are completely committed to it, but they're in an environment where they had to make that change because of pressure from the legislature. Next, increasing the capacity and number of destination programs. Some students pick programs because of the institution. Many pick them because of a specific program. And we certainly have seen that here in many ways. We see this with aviation, automotive technology, mortuary science. I told the story when I got the job here. One of the faculty members at Winthrop said, "Yeah, my son's going to SIU Carbondale." I'm like, "No one leaves South Carolina for college. Why is he going to Carbondale?" And he goes, "Mortuary science." That was it. That was the thing that attracted me. Well, we have some of those programs, but sometimes we need to expand the capacity of those programs. We've been working with Springfield to expand the aviation program there. That's a good example of expanding capacity of current programs. But we can also do add programs. Certainly cybersecurity in growing fields is an opportunity for us, but also even looking at our current programs. Can we change what we're doing? Again, going back to my example, sports management was there before. We doubled the program because we made it more appealing. We changed some of the course requirements. We established a good relationship with our athletic department there. And so students actually could get real world experience with the athletic department. All those things help to grow our enrollment in that program without really changing anything. Sometimes it's simply a name change. When I was at Kent State, one year we went to one of the teachers' conferences and said, which of these programs would be interesting to you for a master's? And we listed the current program names we had and ones we thought might be more appealing. Guess what? The ones that were more appealing, it was like, oh yeah, I would do that. I wouldn't do that program, but I would do that program for sure. It was simply a name change. All of a sudden created an interest in a program because we weren't really describing what it was very well by the name. And in a world of Google searches, that makes a big difference. Do they find what they're looking for? So again, there's a lot we can do on that one. And again, there's a lot of people going to be involved with that. Last thing is growing programs for populations that are not adequately being served. Traditionally in higher education, we were set up to serve that 18-year-old high school graduate. But a lot of the growth is actually in the adult population. And the number of people who left college, never got a degree, didn't go to college, who need to come back for one reason or another is not only large, but it is growing. It is the whole reason the for-profits were as successful as they were. In fact, if you look at some of the national data, they way overcharged. They did all kinds of things, but yet they still had great growth because we just ignored that population for a good portion of my life in higher education. And we really can't afford to continue to ignore that population. And again, not that we're completely ignoring it here, but there are things we can certainly do better, which I'll talk about. And we're certainly seeing this grow. If you look at, remember those high school freshman numbers that were down? You look at older high school freshmen, so 21 and above, it was up 10%. So that was the growth. It wasn't in the traditional age, it was in the other population where we're starting to see some growth. Now, some of it will be degrees, some of it will be credentials, certificate programs, all kinds of things like that can be effective. In fact, graduate certificate programs were up 5.6%, undergraduate certificate programs up 9.9% this year. So much more growth in those than we saw in traditional degree programs. All of that leads to one of the things we've been talking about is, all right, how do we be more competitive? How do we distinguish ourselves from everybody else in the marketplace? The last couple of years as a system, we've been working on the SIU system online, which is a collaboration between the Edwardsville, Carbondale campuses, and to kind of create programs that are available to students online, but you can take classes from any of the schools within the system. So how do we kind of market something a little bit different? To be honest, it doesn't matter whether they ever actually take advantage of it. The fact that it's available and they know this will provide them some flexibility if they need it makes a difference in and of itself. So, and this is not new. The University of Texas system has done this. The University of South Carolina, when I was there, they've done this. I think they have a couple thousand students in what they call their Palmetto College who are doing this type of program. This is not at all unusual. It's not any different than other places doing it. We've been working on how to get the systems to work right, but then we're going to need to work on how do we make this and market this as a bigger thing for SIU so we can really be very competitive with that adult population. So let me finish by saying again, nothing new. This is not my plan. All of this comes from the strategic plans that you all were involved with developing. So for some of you, parts of this at least should sound familiar, but not everybody was involved. So again, I think it's important that we need to communicate as openly as possible about what we're doing, why we're doing it, so people can understand what's kind of going on across the system. And frankly, we need widespread commitment to change because, again, it's not something any one person can do, and we all need to be involved to some degree. So that's it. I am happy to now answer any questions you have.
You mentioned deferred maintenance.
You want the mic so we can get that on the, yeah. Since we're recording, I think that'll help them with the recording.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It was really informative for me. I'm fairly new here. Jody Murray, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. I'm interested in your comments about capital and deferred maintenance. And you know, one of the things that does attract students sometimes artificially, but truly, is the, you know, almost spa-like treatment some universities have in their campuses, where they're really working at making sure the human environment is as welcoming and functional and efficient as they've come to expect. So I just wonder how we plan for and meet the needs of everyday, not just deferred maintenance, but the newest of facilities.
Yeah, it's really a few things. One is we'll continue to ask the state for support. I mean, whether we get all of that we want or not, doesn't mean we're stopping that. In fact, that's going to be really critical. Number two, again, enrollment growth provides additional resources that we can use for anything. Number three, we also can fundraise for some of that. But I will say what we can fundraise for is going to be somewhat different. So you can usually fundraise. I did fundraising for a new science classroom, science education classroom, or a new advising center, or a new this or new that. I was never effective at fundraising for new bathrooms, roofs, or pipes. I mean, it's just not. It's not appealing to fundraising. So that's often where we need to go, either with state support or finding institutional support to do that. It's certainly a priority, but we've got a lot of issues to deal with. And so constantly trying to prioritize what is the most critical to do right now. The fundraising, again, makes whatever they give money for all of a sudden move to the top of the list. And that's the advantage of that.
Hi there, Susan Wegman from Extended Campus, and I'm curious about your strategies and vision for online and digital learning. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, and I think it's, again, not my strategy, kind of a group strategy, but I think that the thought was, again, is creating as many appealing programs for students that they can do either entirely online or largely online. What I will say, which I didn't mention, but we know based on the research, it's interesting. You think online, okay, it doesn't matter where they live. And for some, that'll be the case. But most students like to go to a place where they're at least close enough to drive. So when we're thinking about where we're recruiting from and where we're marketing to, it's probably within a region. This is, again, why doing this as a system expands that footprint even larger than if we just did it as two separate institutions.
Hi, this is Li Cheng Wang, professor from School of Chemical and Biomolecular Sciences. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question related to financial, like Illinois. I know you are in the committee for like a future. I attended a few of the sessions, electronic. Yes. So my question is, I was wondering whether, you know, what's your thought on the outcome of that? Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a good question. I will say I don't know what the outcome is going to be yet. So we just finally got a model for that recently, and it's a first draft. I provided lots of comments to the first draft, but we'll see where we end up with. And this is from the technical working group, which will then feed to the commission, which will then feed to the legislature. So still a lot of sausage making to be in that process. I will say one of the things I meant to mention this earlier is whatever we come up with, it's not an enrollment-based entirely model, but our ability to grow enrollment likely will impact our state appropriations as well as affect us on the tuition side. So it's And our failure to do so will probably hit us on both sides to some extent. And that's different in Illinois. For Illinois, really since the 1970s, we've used an historical based model, which means every year we go up 5% or down 5%, regardless of what's happened with enrollment. I don't expect that to be the future. Other questions? Wait. A little bit. All right, if there are none, I will let you go and get back to your days. I will stay up here for a little bit if someone has a question they don't like to ask in front of the entire audience. Happy to answer those as well. So have a good day and thank you for coming again.